Hi, I'm John, and welcome to Dice Paper Miniatures, episode number 3. I'm really happy to be here today. In fact, I was so excited the last time I recorded that I mentioned my first few projects I was going to focus on Gaslands, Warcry, and possibly Kill Team, which is all true. However, after I finished episode number 2, I realized I had an entire Blood Bowl team sitting on my work table. This is the Willy's Miniatures Chaos Pact, and I'm really excited to show you my progress so far. They're not complete, but they're getting there. So as I was saying, this is the Chaos Pact Blood Bowl team from Willy's Miniatures. So far, I've done about 30 takes for this little segment, so it's basically a dumpster fire. But here we are. So as I was saying, this was the Kickstarter that ran around 2017, and I started working on it in 2018, shortly after I got it. We had a deadline coming up for a tournament at the time, so the requirement for the tournament was to put 3 colors on the model. That being said, I went ahead and did a Zenithal paint scheme of Zendri dust over a Rhinox hide. It turned out okay. It's really subtle, but it is what it is, and I had to get moving. Fortunately, I got my 3 colors on there, I made the deadline, and I played in the tournament. I didn't do great, but I won basically the store house prize. It was basically all the people that attended the tournament put their name in a hat. They drew my name, and I won a Elven team, so that was cool. Anyways, what we're going to be looking at in the next video, well, this video and likely the next video, is just the progress of me working on this team, finishing it up. It's got some problems, to be honest. When I did the base coating, I didn't seal it. So after the tournament, we jumped right into that year's league. And so I probably played like 30 or 40 games with this team, and a lot of the base paint has worn off. I will be going back and touching all of that up in future videos, or at least future video. And then in the process, I've also been working on the skin tones, basically. Those are the first things I got done with the Zenithal priming. They're basically done just by doing that, but I wanted to go in there and kind of diversify up the skin tones and things like that. And the process of me doing that, I use the Citadel shade, the Reichland, I think it's called, Reichland Flesh Shade, and then the Seraphim Sepia, and then I also have the Agrax Earth Shade. On occasion, I mix Nuln oil in there as well. I prefer the glosses, honestly, even though it makes it kind of a pain in the ass when you're actually doing the work, because that natural gloss makes it really difficult to distinguish your natural or the gloss highlights versus your painted highlights. But it is what it is. I know from experience that once I get these completed, I'll hit them with a matte, like a AK Interactive Ultra Matte finish, and it will really dial back and even out the overall tones of all of the colors, whether they're glossy or semi-glossy. It'll flatten all those out to a nice even finish. So that'll help with all of that extra glossiness. The other reason why, or the main reason why I prefer the glosses, though, in case you're wondering, is that they tend to flow over the model better. So that's a thing. They're a little bit more rich too, but it's mostly that control of flowing through the model. And I can also subtract and add kind of on the fly as I add those shades on the model itself. So yeah, that being said, I do have a long ways to go, and this video just more or less features 3 of the actual models from the team. I'm dialing in the flesh tones for those specific 3 models. Future episodes will feature more or less all the models at some point in time in their overall painted development. And towards the end of this series of videos, we'll see the whole team in its glory. Now, if you stick through to the end of this video, I actually spent some time on Twitch earlier in the week working on photo editing some old photos of my original Chaos Renegades Blood Bowl team from Blood Bowl First Edition. These things are like back from 1991. So they're old, At the time, I thought the paint job was pretty decent. I was 16 or 17 at the time, and this was one of the first teams of models that I painted. So I took it pretty seriously, even though they may look kind of goofy. But anyways, I don't have those models anymore. I actually sold those probably like 10 years ago on eBay. Little bit of regret. But like I said, if you stay through to the end, you'll get a chance to take a look at some of those photos as well. All right, well, thanks for being here, and let's get started. So here I'm about to start painting one of the Chaos Pact Blood Bowl miniatures. This is one of the human marauders. The video will focus on 3 of the Chaos Pact marauders. This particular one, as with most of the human marauders, had a zenithal base coat done, with the first coat being Rhinox hide, and then on top of the Rhinox hide I use Xandri dust. This one was one of the models I actually used in the tournament and in the league that I mentioned earlier in the video. So it has its other base colors on there, both red and black. The red base coat is Mephiston red, and the black base coat is Abaddon black. The wash I'm using is the Reichland Flesh Shade Gloss, and as I mentioned, I prefer gloss because in my experience, gloss flows over the model just a little better. It's easier to manipulate and control too, it seems like. You can either add more to it while it's still wet and it seems to flow where I want it to flow, or I can use a dry brush to kind of absorb and wick away some of the extra shade, and yeah, it just gets an effect I prefer. Admittedly, the gloss does provide a bit of a gloss. That can be somewhat distracting when you're working on the model later on, when you're adding maybe some more shading or more highlights. I should mention before I started adding the Reichland Flesh Shade that even though I did a zenithal of Xandri dust over the Rhinox hide, I did do a little touch-up work and did some a little bit of layering, a little bit of wet blending between the 2 colors, but I also used Mournfang brown. So that was kind of my mid-tone I used when I was trying to touch up areas between the Xandri dust and the Rhinox hide. You'll notice in the next 2 models that I paint, all that had been completed on those particular 2 models was just the zenithal priming effect. I had not used those in the tournament or in the league. I may have numbered their bases just to have as a backup on the roster, but they definitely were not used in the tournament because they didn't have the 3 base colors, but it's possible I may have used them in the league. That was over a year ago now, so I can't quite recall for certain. But my strategy, speaking specifically to this miniature, it's just to kind of get a general even layer over the entire model and add a little bit more shade in some of the crevices, basically wherever the natural zenithal priming left more of the darker value. That's where I try to add a little bit more shade as well. And since I'm still relatively new to recording myself painting, there's going to be some footage where things might be a little out of focus. The light balance may be a little off. There may be a little, the exposure itself may be a little dark, or the exposure may be a little light, but we're getting there. And I do have the speed of this going at about 200% for those just kind of curious. It is sped up for sure. Now, personally, I'm not much of a paint licker, but apparently, yeah, from time to time, you'll see me chomping on a paintbrush, and every now and then for comedic relief, if anything, my a very full, crunchy beard, if you will, and I'll, just for humor value, we'll put paintbrushes into my beard. That used to be more of a thing when I wasn't recording. I found that something I didn't quite expect, but my typical setup of where I have my lamps now combined with the camera, where I have the camera located, having a number of brushes, whether they're in my mouth or stuck in my beard, they tend to bump into the camera or bump into my light. So I'm trying to be better about breaking, I guess you could call it a bad habit, and putting the brushes down, whether on the table or on my paint pot or my brush holder itself. But in regards to painting the model itself, between the Zenithal paint scheme, the little bit of layering and wet blending that I did, adding that shade just really kind of pulls everything together too. There's a lot of value and depth that's achieved in this approach for painting. As I paint other models in this range in the future, you'll see a little bit more from where I started right after the Zenithal priming. You'll see a little bit of that in the following two models, but definitely more in future videos. And on occasion, I definitely take a little bit of a break just to kind of review the model, making sure I haven't missed any areas, and just get a general, overall feeling for how things are looking. I know this model I basically stopped for now. I definitely need to add a little bit of touch-ups here and there, especially on the face. I need to work in, if not a little bit of like a 5 o'clock shadow, just a little bit of different coloring in the face, in regards to like the cheeks, a little bit of a stubble, even though he's got a bit of a goatee already, possibly implying a little bit of a hairline where his head's shaved. I'm kind of on the fence with how far I want to take it, if I want it to be tabletop only or if I want it to be a little bit more of a display. At this point, it's probably leaning more towards display than just tabletop, because I'm definitely taking some time on getting back into painting and just kind of seeing where my current skill levels are at, because I am pretty rusty at the moment. I haven't mentioned this yet, but you may have noticed that I tend to have my glasses off while I'm painting, and I just have really poor vision. I can see up close about maybe 10 to 12 inches away, and then anything past that, it's just very blurry. So while I'm painting, on occasion, I have an older pair of glasses I sometimes use, or I just don't wear glasses at all. But yeah, that causes me to be right up there on the camera, right up there on the miniature. But as I was saying, I have 3 models total. This is the second one. And this is a good example. This only had the Zenithal Prime coat. And I didn't use this one in the tournament. I think I used this in the league though. The league did not require your models to have any paint, to be honest, but definitely not the 3 colors. But I primed them all at the same time, so that's why, even though if I didn't use it in the tournament, it was available just in case for the league that followed. But right now, I wanted to get this model to be a little bit of a darker skin tone. In fact, I kind of progressively get darker. The first model had kind of an extreme tan, if you will. This one will be a little bit more of a, well, a mid brown, if you will, kind of a, I guess, somewhat of an African American or black person skin coloring, and then it gets a little bit darker from there in the next model. But this is more of a, this is technically a human mutant model. He's got the horns, which is a mutation, but he kind of also looks a little bit like a Beastman, which again, being a Chaos affiliated team, instead of that being brown skin, it could be implied like a brown fur, if you will. But yeah, just putting a single layer, just kind of a thin coat, if you will, just to kind of tone down the overall value. I'm not being very particular as far as cleanliness with my painting. I'm definitely overlapping to some of the other elements of the model, but it's no big deal. That'll all get painted over in the future. And I try my best to work from the inside out, so to speak, so you'll see that from other miniature painters, especially from like if you've watched any old Games Workshop miniature painting videos, as well as just other painters on YouTube. You tend to kind of work from the inside out. That way, as you're painting, that layer is complete, and then you start painting the layer on top of that, or layer implying an article of clothing, armor, etc. So the first layer in this example would be your skin. The second layer would be like the fur or cloth. And then like the third layer probably be your armored bits. And then possibly if there's any other little minor detail on top of the armor, whether it's like a leather strap or other kind of little trinket, if you will, that may get painted last. And then depending on my mood, sometimes I try to paint the face right away, since that's the focal point of the model. It kind of dictates the level of detail from there on out. If you do a very detailed face, there's a good chance you might detail the rest of the model further, or at least it gives you a gauge of you don't need to detail the rest of the model. The further away you pull away from the face, if you're trying to save time, you could put less detail in those outer parts. Whereas if you have a very simplistic face, you're definitely probably going to have a fairly simplistic overall paint job, because it's kind of visually jarring to have a face that looks like it's not painted, but then other elements of the model having more defined painted areas. It kind of makes your eye bounce around and not have a focal point. So that's usually why artists in general, and it applies to miniature painting too, you'll have a focal point be the face. That's where as a person you're naturally prone to look at first, is try to find the eyes of whatever it is you're looking at. When it's like a humanoid or an animal, you're just naturally looking for that kind of recognition, the focal point, which is usually the face. So again, just finishing up that first layer, and I'm about done here. I definitely like your feedback on this too. Right now, I typically, when you see these types of videos, you don't always see the artist, if you will. It's usually just focusing exclusively on the painted model. If you were to see the palette or see the artist, that's usually on a live stream, which I also have a format for that. And that format usually includes like an overlay of graphics, but with recorded content like this, as opposed to live stream content, I find that those overlays just don't work as well when the content's recorded. But that being said, I'm personally on the fence if there's any value to seeing my mug, if you will, or my palette, as opposed to just looking at the model itself while I paint. So I'd like to hear your feedback on that. My perspective on it is, it's nice to see how the artist works, not just how his technique is on the model, but kind of see the environment he's in and how he approaches the subject. Lighting, where his hands are on the table, things like that. Now that I have that base coat on, I'm also applying a shade to this particular miniature. And this is also using mostly the Reichland flesh shade, but there's also some other shades. This one is mostly using Reichland earth shade, but I've also worked in a little Agrax earth shade, just for a little bit of a darker value. It's not quite as red or warm as the Reichland flesh shade, so that kind of offsets that a little bit. It separates a little bit more from the previous model in terms of overall tonality. Now, unlike the previous model, I didn't do quite as much. In fact, I don't think I did any wet blending on the skin tones at all. I mostly had the zenithal effect, and then I just went ahead and put a one thin coat over the overall model. Kind of skipped that step of layering and wet blending and just went right into the shade and creating washes to build my, you could say, volumes with light and dark. Obviously working on the dark sections with this shade. Now on the extreme shadow areas of this miniature, I did add a little contrast, Citadel color contrast paint using the Cygor brown. It's a really dark brown, and that kind of helped define the forms just a little bit more. You can kind of see, definitely on the shadow parts of the model, underneath the arms, the lower ribs, underneath the legs. That's where I really kind of went heavy on adding that Cygor brown. And this is basically the miniature with the final shade or wash applied. Just kind of doing a general look over. And for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how things turned out. I'm going to start working on the highlights right now. I do apologize. When I came back to working on this stage of the miniature, my exposure settings, my light settings were pretty bright, so that's a thing. Eventually I dial it back down, but in the meantime it is pretty bright. To some extent that's better as far as viewing the model, but it means I'll probably, if I use this lighter setting, I'll need to wear my other black glove, just because my the reflection from my hand's pretty intense. But yeah, for the highlights, I'm mostly using a combination of Mournfang Brown, a little Rhinox hide, but mostly just layers of Mournfang Brown, and maybe just adding a little bit of Xandri Dust, just for the lightest of edges. And this paint is pretty thinned out too. I should have mentioned that earlier. If I'm not doing much wet into wet, or even if I am doing wet into wet, I mix a lot of medium, like layman medium, or straight up flow improver. It thins it out, but it usually keeps the pigmentation relatively okay, and it allows me to build up through just subtle layering my highlight values. It reestablishes the midtones and builds up my highlight values. I'm ultimately trying to catch just the high points of the model, the high points of the form where based on what the Zenithal Prime Coat provided as a guide, these were pretty subtle, so I'm actually trying to exaggerate some of those high points on the model itself. It's definitely somewhat exaggerated because lower down on the model, arguably I could have kept some of those highlights off or not as intense, but I went for a little bit of an all-around light source, which isn't the most realistic, but part of me getting back into the hobby again is, you know, practicing a couple different techniques, kind of evaluate how I want to maintain my lighting. Do I want to keep it true to the actual light source or the Zenithal priming? Or do I want to be a little bit more creative with it and abstract and just kind of intensify the volume of each form by exaggerating the highlights and shadows? Should also mention I use a variety of brushes, some on the cheaper end, some on the more expensive end. These are not the best overall, but they're not bad. The tip of the points are a little blunted, and they don't hold all that much volume, and they don't hold all that much fluid, if you will, paint medium in the belly of the brush. Admittedly, it's a small brush size. I prefer to use a slightly larger than necessary size so it holds more paint and medium. But when you're feeling not as confident maybe as you should be, you end up resorting to a smaller size and kind of approaching at it more delicately. And here I'm just reviewing the model, checking out my overall value so far. Like I said, I kind of intensified the lights and darks on this model. Definitely can notice where I really define the muscles on the back. Probably a little excessive, but overall I like it. And I kind of like pushing contrast when it comes to lights and darks, especially for tabletop quality, even though these might be past that level, but I like being able to push it that way from a distance on a tabletop. You can still kind of see the definition of the sculpt itself. But yeah, just getting kind of a slow review here, just kind of looking over the overall aesthetics and balance of the tones, colors, etc. Now I'm actually going into the third and final model, at least for this video. And as I mentioned before, I kind of wanted to increase the darkness of the skin tones, right? So the first one had more of a tan. The second one started taking on more of a person of color. So this is going over the model again with a Mournfang brown, just to get that kind of a darker base coat to work from. Just a single thin coat. As I'm putting on that initial thin coat, I am trying to establish a little bit of volumes by layering a little bit more within the seams of the sculpt. Almost wet blending, if you will, but mostly just a second layer in the crevices of the overlapping muscle shapes. Now this is that combination of shade and contrast paint that I spoke about at the beginning of this model. This is a little bit of Reichland Flesh Shade Gloss, but mostly Agrax Earth Shade combined with the contrast paint Cygor Brown. Now I'm really getting dark on this one. It's definitely more of a thicker coat, if you will. Just kind of layering it all over. Definitely not wicking away too much of the shade at this step anyways. You can see the second coat I go even darker, especially when you see the back side of the model. You can really tell I've darkened up this shade quite a bit. It was still just a little bit too light. It was too similar to the previous model in terms of the skin color. And then like I did previously, once I complete a stage, to just kind of do a review of the actual miniature, make sure everything looks like it was evenly coated. There's good transitions from the crevices where the muscle forms meet versus the high point of the muscle. Now I'm going back in and trying to bring out those forms even further. Mostly, again, this time it's a little bit more of the Rhinox hide, but it's a Rhinox hide and Mournfang brown mix. But with adding in some layman's medium again and some flow improver. I kind of go back and forth between the layman's medium and flow improver. Technically that's the true flow drying retarder that I use for medium to kind of help with layering the paint and thinning them out slightly at this step. Again, I try to hit the parts of the model that had the natural zenithal highlights but then I just kind of exaggerate it further, so the natural highlights are being intensified, and then where areas might be slightly in shade, I'm still hitting them with a little bit of highlight. Again, I'm just trying to push the contrast a little bit further. And yeah, just kind of reviewing that first step of trying to bring those highlights back, or at least the midtones back. And as I mentioned earlier in the video too, the risk of using the gloss versions of these Citadel shades, it makes it somewhat difficult to determine if the highlight is just the gloss of the paint, or if you layered in your highlights correctly with actual paint versus just a light reflection. And as I said too earlier, most of the faces on all three of these models were taken to about 80% completion. I still need to do some highlights. I still need to do some values related to like maybe implying some hair stubble or facial stubble, maybe some scarring, some slight tonality differences, maybe adding a little bit of reddy or ruddiness to the cheeks, and then of course the eyes, and if there's an open mouth, then working on the, you know, the mouth, teeth, the tongue, etc., lips. Lips usually though are just the skin tone, at least on male models, they're the skin tone just lightened up slightly more, just a little bit of a pop. Yeah, just keep building up those values. And for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out as well. Again, I'll have to go back and do some work on the face, or the head in general. Like I mentioned, those are the focal points typically, so that's what I try to work on. I initially was using Reikland Flesh Shade Gloss, and then I kind of worked in a little bit of the Cygor Brown, which is from the Contrast paint line. On the third miniature, I didn't use much of the Reikland at all, just a little. I worked in more of the Cygor Brown still, of course, and then I ended up using more Agrax Earthshade Gloss on this particular model. Currently, the three models that I've been working on for the duration of this video come from the Willy's Miniatures Chaos Pact team. I started painting these up too back at the end of 2018. for a local tournament that led into a local league. And now's the time, especially with our current global situation, trying to get caught up and get this team finished up, because once that league starts up again, I want to use this team. At least that's the plan anyways. But at the moment, what we're seeing here is the basically all the models that came with that particular box set, and they're just Zenithal primed in that Rhinox hide as the first layer, and then I Zenithal primed on top of that with the Xandri dust. The bases themselves are just Citadel texture paint, a couple different layers to create that extra bit of cracking that occurred. I did not use that effect for the Apothecary or Cheerleader though. That was just a single layer, so you'll notice maybe the textures aren't quite as extreme on those models versus my actual team models. And you'll also notice on pretty much all the models, I also did some custom base work with some old plastic skulls from the Citadel line, a mixture of some horns and fangs and claws and some other skulls, and as well as like little miscellaneous bits here and there, chains and whatnot. When I go to finish these, I'll also do some tufts to add in and potentially some like blood effects. That's the plan anyways. So that's it for now. Like I said, I'll have the rest of this team hopefully painted within the next couple weeks, which may mean it may take 1 or 2 more episodes to get through all of these. It's about 20 models really, so yeah, with my current workload, it may take me a little bit of time. However, definitely consider following me on Twitch and see me live stream, which may have some of this future content in that live stream. And then also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. I really appreciate that. Especially helps with the algorithm for these videos to pop up on your feed. And yeah, thanks so much for being here. Hope you are having a good week. Be safe and take care. Bye-bye.